Okay, we have a different speaker that's going to cover Security Server, and I'll let Paul introduce himself, say hello, and then we'll go ahead and get started here.
My name is Paul Krutza. I work in the IIC here in Dallas. Actually, I'm actually remote. I live in Tyler, which is about 100 miles east of Dallas, but I've worked with the group since about 2000. So I've been here quite some time. My primary role is with early test programs, as Paul said. So we work with pre-generally available code for ISVs that want to prepare their products before we actually release the GA release of ZOS. And one of the other things that I've done quite a lot of in our environment is work with the security settings for what we're required to do within IBM to protect our systems. As you might imagine, the bringing outside sessions from the internet into our environment does require quite a lot of management of security. So we deal with that quite, very much all the time. We'll just move on forward with this presentation. This is specifically about the feature product, the optional product called RACF, part of the security server of ZOS. So the unit objectives, first we're going to describe the RACF authentication process, a little bit about RACF in general. We'll talk about SAP, which is a security authorization facility, which is a base element where RACF is an optional feature. We'll look at some of the RACF commands that you can use. We'll also look at the options that you can set for RACF for the environment itself. We will talk a little bit about Protect All, which is something you should know about if you're going to be maintaining a RACF environment. And also there are utilities that can be used for administrative and auditing reports. There are many utilities that can be used. Specifically, we're going to look a little bit at the utilities that you can use for auditor and administrator reporting capabilities. And then the last one would be for a little bit about passwords. So, as the name suggests, the acronym is RACF. It stands for Resource Access Control Facility. As you can see with the first bullet there, it's part of the security server on ZOS. But there are other software vendors that have add-on products that can also be used instead of RACF. What I like to point out about RACF in general, if you look at the name, it sort of tells you what the design point was. The resource in the name was the part of the design point of RACF was to, as it says, to control access to resources rather than focus on a user or a group of users. So if you think of RACF, you have to realize from a design point, it was always about defining resources and protecting those resources. So we have gone to quite extensive levels of resource identification so that then we can set certain constructs in place to protect those resources. Once they are protected, you give access control through RACF to those resources. So that's sort of the design point rather than focusing on a user and giving access from a user standpoint. Part of the responsibility of any security product would be to identify and authenticate users. Then we would authorize users, as I said, to those protected resources. But you also need to be able to log and report unauthorized access so that auditors, administrators can maintain the system and also report potential violations. One thing that it doesn't say here is that you can also report unauthorized access. And some auditing firms and internal auditing groups, they want to know at a certain level what actually the authorized access was. So it is another level of reporting. It's not something that we typically get involved in, but an auditor likes to see those kinds of reports. And we obviously, we control the means of access to these resources. Just a little bit of overview about how RACF is put together. As you can see in the middle of the screen, this represents the RACF feature, and you see there is a RACF database. Well, the RACF database contains the constructs for the protected resources, and also it contains the user ID identification and the rules that are in place for each of those. In this particular diagram, at the top you see that there is a security administrator. The security administrator is responsible for making the definitions that a customer has defined either with their management or their security team about how the system needs to be implemented, from which resources need to be protected, and at what level users are given access to the resources. On this side, you see that there's a user that needs some sort of authentication. Obviously, they interact with the RACF system based on what the system administrator has set up for the protection of that resource and what the management team has defined for this particular user. We give or refuse access to the resource, and at the end of the day, some reports may be generated that an auditor can look at and see what kind of violations might have occurred. Just a little bit more about how this is put together within the system, and we'll talk a little bit more about the Security Authorization Facility. This is called SAP, and it is not an optional feature. As you can see, it sits in the middle of this chart. This is part of the base operating system. And as this chart suggests, a request comes in for permission. It goes through some resource manager. That has this is making a standard call to the Security Authorization Facility. Those calls are standard. The Security Authorization Facility sits here. If RACF is installed, it will access RACF through system authorization, and RACF will do a database query, give the results back of the query back to SAP. SAP makes a standard return back to the caller, and the permission is either denied or permitted based on what the recommendation was. If RACF is not present, this may be another security product. There are exits that, and I think it's on maybe on the next, one of the next foils or charts here, but there are exit points that are available from SAP so that another vendor's security product can be plugged in if that is preferred by the customer. And this gives you a little bit more information about SAP. It is part of ZOS. Once again, as I said, if RACF is there, it will use RACF to do the authorization checks. But it can use an optional exit routine, which there are standard places that SAP can be connected to other products. And once again, it gives us a layer that enables resource management to make standard calls so that there don't have to be direct calls or customized calls made to a product, either RACF or one of the other security products. You don't have to make a different call depending on the product that's installed. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about RACF administration. There are ISPF panels. I'm sorry, is there a question?
Does SharePack and PKI run parallel, or they probably talk to each other, or do they work hand in hand? I don't know how to put the question together.
I'm sorry, there was a question in the room about PKI services and whether or not that was a separate capability or it was something that is controlled by RACF. And we do have, RACF does store certificates and can provide that level of authentication.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? All right. As I said, administration of RACF can happen in multiple ways here. There is an ISPF interface that gives a full-screen ISPF panel administration capability. There are also RACF commands that can be executed either through TSO or through batch with a terminal monitor program. And also, the console has some specific type commands that can be issued to RACF, and I think we talk a little bit about that somewhere along the way. There are also utilities that are provided with the product. Again, as I said, we'll look at a couple of these that give detailed reports on how the database has been defined, and also on how some of the constructs are put together for different users and groups. I think this next chart is an example of the primary RACF administration panel. On our system, the verb to use would be =R. If you're on a panel, you can enter =R, and you'll see this primary option menu within RACF. As you can see, there are multiple selections that it's similar to other panels within ISPF, where you drill down, and the farther you drill, the more information that you're required to provide. And we'll talk about some of these different capabilities. We'll also look at them in command form. But I'll just mention here that there are different types of profiles. There's something here called dataset profiles, which we use quite extensively, and it's been provided as sort of a separate resource profile function. Then you see something called general resource profiles. Those are profiles that, again, when you're talking about protecting resources, there's a vast array of different types of resources that we can protect, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But to give you an example, we can protect hardware resources. At one time, as you can imagine, we had physical terminals that were attached to the system, cabled directly to a control unit, cabled directly to the processor before we had TCP/IP, before we had internet, before we had all those kinds of connections. Well, in many cases, those terminals, to give you a hardware example, depending on where the physical terminal was located, if you take for example, in a bank, if there was a physical terminal located in a particular area, it would be defined to RACF at the terminal level, which would require logon, and based on authentication, you may or may not be able to use that terminal. Another example would be in operations even today. If you have a terminal that's sitting in the tape library, many times that's separate from the system console area in a customer environment. So a tape operator doesn't have necessarily the same authentication, it doesn't have the same level of security that a system operator would have. So if a tape operator is in tape operations and they're required to log on to a console, they log on with their credentials, they're able to issue tape operator commands, and they're not allowed to issue some of the other types of modify commands that Paul has shown you that are system type commands.
And Paul, your explanation was really good. And what I was thinking about was we even protect commands themselves. So, for example, on our system here, we protect commands, and because we protect commands, we can make a RACF statement. The resource is the command, and we can make statements and say, you as a user, your user ID are allowed to do display commands, but you're not allowed to do commands that vary hardware off and on or modify the environment. So resources, commands is a resource, and then we get granularity within there.
Right.
Display versus modify. So would that be a pretty good example?
Exactly. And other types of resources, for example, are Unix System Services resources. So that they don't fit into a category of data set. It's a file within Unix System Services. You may have DASD volumes that are physical volumes that we may or may not allow certain users to access because we don't want them to be able to, make a change on a volume. There may be a different level of access to a volume where you could initialize it versus read it or write it. Okay, so there is a tremendous amount of control, as you can imagine, but it gives us the flexibility to protect the system adequately. The next thing that you see on this panel is something called group profiles and user-to-group connections. And we'll talk a little bit about groups, but the option 4 there is user profiles and passwords. And I prefer to talk about users first. We authenticate at the user ID level. You can use passwords that we have passwords set up here that are 8 characters. You can also use passphrases if you so desire to set that up. We don't have that turned on in our system. But groups, as you might imagine, are groups of users. So there can be many, many group profiles set up on the system. Groups can be, you can give access to resources at the group level or specifically at the user level. A user may be a part of multiple groups. So you'll see in some of the displays that we show different names for groups. There's a group called SysOne. There's a group called Group 1. There may be a group called Group Z. You could be a member of Group 1 without being a member of Group 2, or vice versa. You could be a member of both Group 1 and Group 2. Group 1 could be assigned to a resource that Group 2 does not know anything about. And depending on what users are in those groups, those users would only get access to the resources that those groups would have access to. Okay. The other things here, there's a system options, and we'll talk a little bit about system options. Those are the options that you use to customize RACF itself. And the remote sharing facility, we're not going to get into that too much, just so you know that we do have the capability to target other RACF databases and RACF systems